And we're live. Hello and welcome everyone. And hello again to those who are joining us on our third session. My name is Christine Danner. I'm the Multimedia Manager for CTAN, and we are so excited that all of you are attending today. I'd like to remind you that while our speakers are talking, we would love it if you would put any questions you have into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll have time to address the questions after the talk. And now I'd like to introduce Will Kletter, the Director of Customer Success at Climate AI. We'll be hearing his talk, Shared Resilience, using AI to create a more resilient food system for farmers, consumers, and the planet. So without further ado, Will.
Christine, thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining today. I'm gonna share my screen here. Let's hope this works. You'd think a year into the pandemic I'd be able to do this very confidently, but I still get nervous every time. So, okay, so hopefully this is working. Christine, you'll stop me if it's not. But yeah, so as Christine mentioned, what I want to talk to you about today is the way that we at Climate AI and people in the space generally are using AI to create a more climate resilient food system. And what we mean by this is a food system that allows farmers to better prepare for disasters, that make sure that consumers can have access to high quality, nutritious, and hopefully sustainable foods that they seek, and one that's in balance with the planet. So to frame this conversation, I want to tell two stories. I want to tell a story about small farmers and big food companies, and I want to tell a story about a laptop and a supercomputer. And as you can kind of tell, each of these stories has a bit of a David and Goliath element to them. There's sort of a small entity and a big entity. And our second story really fits this bill. We've got a scrappy upstart in the laptop going against an established player, a big incumbent that's been doing things the same way for a really long time. And spoiler alert, in this case, the David wins, the laptop wins. The laptop is able to beat the supercomputer in the challenge. But I'll get to that a little bit later, because I want to start with our first story, which is a little bit different. And it's often easy to think about sort of small farmers and big food companies as in conflict, as opposed to one another. And to be very clear, these relationships have a lot of conflict. There are debt traps, lawsuits over misappropriation of technology, use or misuse or aggressive marketing of harmful chemicals, pricing pressure, a whole list of things that are very, very bad, and that often make the press and can sort of color our perception of how sort of smaller farmers and larger entities interact. But the reality is that on the ground, it's not all conflict. And especially when it comes to forward-thinking companies and the way that they choose to engage with smaller farmers in their supply chain. Because the reality is in agriculture, the Goliaths of the world are often just made up of thousands of Davids. So what do I mean by that? So you think of one of the biggest food companies you can think of, PepsiCo. I know we think of them as soft drinks, but they've got Frito-Lay and Quaker Oats. They really are a food processor in addition to a seller of brands that we all know. So they might source from large industrial farms, and they might source from medium-sized or larger family farms. And especially in certain geographies, they will also source from smaller farms. And it's their challenge to integrate the inputs from these different providers through a complex logistics and distribution process to get food on the table of customers or on the supermarket shelf, in a restaurant, whatever the end market happens to be. But the point here is that even for a company as big as PepsiCo, small farmers can make up a meaningful contribution to the overall food supply chain. So for example, family farms operate 75% of the world's agricultural land. This is not to be confused with small farms, which is only 12%, because you can have larger family farmers. But it starts to give you the impression that when we think about the food system, when we think about the food supply chain, it all comes back to the farm level. And what that means is that a challenge for one part of that food system, a challenge at the farm level, very quickly becomes a challenge for the food system. So a challenge for a part is a challenge for the whole. I want to give a quick example from my own personal experience that sort of illustrates this point. I'm going to talk about a market problem before we get into the primary focus of today's conversation, which is, of course, climate. So just very quickly, there's a company called ITC, used to be called the India Tobacco Company. Not a major brand necessarily in a lot of the world, but it's actually one of the largest conglomerates in India. They also own hotels and restaurants. They're a huge, huge, huge company. They're the second largest buyer of wheat in India after the Indian government. So they faced a challenge in that they were having trouble with reliability and stability of their supply chain. That they weren't there, and their suppliers, small farmers, were facing an issue of transparency. They weren't sure what the market prices were, so they weren't sure what to sell to whom and when. This meant obviously great difficulty in their individual livelihoods, but also uncertainty at the top of the supply chain for ITC to understand what products they would get, would be able to have access to. And this was really important for ITC, and this is going to be an important sort of theme throughout, is that in a lot of markets, you face a very tight supply market for any good, which means there isn't enough people growing a product to match the demand. And so it's for that reason that companies like ITC ultimately do care about what happens to individual farmers, because in a complex food system where you're competing over supply, just as you are competing over customers, every community matters. So what did ITC do in this case? Well, it invented a system called eChopal, which is that Chopal means public space. It's a simple sort of community hub built around a computer with internet access where farmers could use to access market prices, get better transparency, and understand when to sell. This eventually developed into a full service sort of community hub selling other goods and services from education and healthcare to just basic household items that may not be as accessible in a more rural area. And they've really become the center of these communities. And I've had the chance to see a lot of them, and it's quite impressive. The result was that farmers now had a single source that they could go to get information, to sell their product at a price that they knew to be sort of the fair market price. And ITC got a sticky supply chain. They got growers who were integrated into their ecosystem and a reliable and higher quality output. The reason I tell this story is to give an example of how a small problem can become a larger supply chain problem, and how working collaboratively across the supply chain can solve that problem for everyone. And this is really important because, as the conference today indicates, we have some pretty large problems coming to us. And that is, of course, the problem of climate change. At Climate AI, we often talk about climate change not just as a distant problem, but as a now problem. So what you see here is what we call our year of departure analysis. We refer to the year of departure as when the 25th percentile event, let's say sort of temperature, becomes the 75th percentile event. The non-technical way of saying that is simply when the range of the average fundamentally shifts. So what we see in this example, which I believe is in the Middle East, is that by 2036, we can expect the fundamental range of average temperatures in this geography to have moved. But for the 20 years prior, we will see this average jump to different levels. So the volatility has already begun in this geography. And what does that actually mean? How do we translate that impact? Well, we translate it in two ways: more extreme events and greater variability of those events. So on the last slide, if you looked closely at the very, very small print on the y-axis, you would have seen that this fundamental shift in the average was actually a sort of maybe 1 or 2 degree Celsius degree increase, which may not feel very meaningful. But as the example on the left shows, a 1 degree shift in mean temperatures can mean that the probability of an extreme temperature on sort of that tail risk can go from 50% to nearly 100%. In agriculture, this is super important. crops have what are called killing conditions, where up to a certain point, they might experience stress. The quality may not be as good. They may not be as nutritious. They may be more vulnerable to quality that affects sort of human health, like spoilage. But above a certain threshold, it's very simple. They just die. And that is obviously quite devastating for farmers. And as we've talked about, can be devastating to entire supply chains. So adding to this issue is that with climate change will come increasing seasonal variability. And so what you see on the right is a map of the increasing seasonal variability of rainfall in this case. So we see more variation between seasons, so from year to year, and within a specific season. So putting that together, what we have is more extreme events and less understanding of when they may occur. And the impact on agriculture is very significant. So in the developing world, we already see, according to the FAO, that 25% of climate-related disaster costs are absorbed in the agricultural sector. This is probably an undercount because I don't think it accounts for extreme heat leading to a greater food spoilage in the supply chain. I think it's primarily focused on what happens within the farm gate. But it's not just the developing world either. In the US in 2019, we saw record floods across the Midwest, which is where most of sort of the row crops like corn and soybean are grown, so the largest crops in the US by acreage, leading to billions of dollars of damages, most of which was absorbed by the agricultural sector. You can think about this in terms of wildfires impacting vineyards in California. You can think about this in terms of the derecho, an extreme wind event in Iowa. There's unfortunately, the list of examples of extreme events could take up this entire talk. And so this shouldn't really come as a surprise to you. But again, I want to emphasize this point that while these impacts start on the farm, they echo across the supply chain and across the food system. So let's take the example of, let's go back to our example of wheat in India. Now with climate change, we often think about sort of these extreme high temperatures, and indeed that's what I've spoken about so far. In reality, what sort of the first canary in the coal mines, as it were, the initial warning signs, take the form of rising minimum temperatures. So this can impact a crop like pistachios or other tree nuts, maybe tuber vegetables, which need a certain amount of colder hours in order to go through their maturation process. So that becomes threatened pretty quickly. And it also threatens crops like winter wheat, which are grown during the cooler seasons, because that's sort of a more ideal temperature band to get good output. And there's been a lot of study on the impacts of wheat in India. I began my career looking at, as an environmental consultant in India, looking at it. And since then it's been studied, 1,000 more times. There's a lot of different estimates. What I have on the slide here is probably among the more extreme ones, but sort of estimated losses of this winter wheat crop between 4 and 36%. And that's obviously devastating for farmers. But if you aggregate that across the supply chain, that is a lot of supply that's not available, which creates a significant logistical problem for the food processor to identify where it's going to get product to sell to customers. And usually the result of that is a price increase for customers. Now, when you think about wheat in India, it's a staple crop. Increasing price on that product will likely mean additional malnourishment and hunger and an inability to access food for end customers in that market and in markets around the world. So this is a really important problem. And just like the problem we saw earlier, one that needs to be solved across the supply chain, which is why I talk about this idea of creating a shared resilience across the supply chain for our food system. One of the challenges is that the tools available to farmers, food companies, whomever in the food and ag space are relatively limited. The most common tool that is used is the historical average. So you may have heard of the term the farmer's almanac. This is basically just like a history book of weather. Tells you with great specificity what rain you can expect how much rain you can expect on a given day, et cetera. And most of the agricultural industry, even very large advanced companies, will still just use the average when it comes to understanding what is going to happen in the upcoming season, how to plan what crops they source, how to plan the timing of certain decisions like planting and harvest. All of that is based on what's happened historically. And if this sounds simple, it is, but the reality is in a world without climate change, it works just fine. Because you might have a little bit of variation around the average, but the truth is, if it's very microscopic or whatever, and only certain times of the year, you can kind of work with it. But in a world of climate change, the observed will increasingly depart from the average, and the error will increase to a point where it's going to cause considerable problems. So then obviously the next step is, okay, well, let's stop using the average, let's use a forecast. But it turns out there's a lot of challenges with forecasting events on a time scale that is going to be meaningful to people, that allows them to actually take a corrective action. And the New York Times highlighted this very recently in an op-ed, which I would encourage folks to read. And this challenge brings us to our second story, the real David and Goliath, the story of a laptop versus a supercomputer, or the initial climate AI model versus the leading government weather forecasting systems, such as the European model, the ECMWF, and the US model, NOAA, and then there's models all over the world that engage in weather forecasting. So in order to understand this story, we first need to spend a little bit of time talking about how supercomputer-based models or physical or dynamical models work today. We often at Climate AI like to use the analogy of golf. So imagine that you are golfing. There's a lot of different factors that will go into how you hit the ball and where the ball will go. It could be how you're standing, it could be what club you're using, how you set the ball on the tee, what the wind is doing at that specific location, or the moisture in the air, whatever the case may be, and of course how you swing. And so a weather forecast works pretty similar in that you have a set of what are called initial conditions, which is a term that comes from chaos theory, a set of initial conditions, and then you can simulate, given what we know about those initial conditions, what might happen. In other words, given what we can observe about where someone is standing, the club they're using, the swing, where is the ball likely to go? And so if you just simulate that 1,000 times, you start to get a pretty good, and take the average, you start to get a pretty good sense of where the ball might go by looking at sort of all the different possibilities. The problem then is one of time. So in that golf analogy, let's say across each 1,000 different simulations, there are very slight differences in those initial conditions. If we only want to know where the ball is going about 10 to 15 feet ahead of us, then all of those errors won't really have made much of a difference yet. You can kind of assume that the average golfer would have hit the ball straight for the first 10 feet, and it'll look straight. The problem is that if you're trying to measure out to, let's say, the end of a couple hundred feet course, then all those errors start to compound, and that's where you start to say, okay, well, my ball went into the woods, or my ball went straight, my ball went off to the right, because all those sort of tiny differences in initial conditions start to really matter. And we see the same thing with weather prediction. So for about 10 to 14 days, so if we sort of imagine a starting point here on the left, and then simulate, given what we know about the initial conditions, and take the average of those simulations, there's a relatively tight range of outcomes for those initial 10 to 14 days. As a result, weather forecasting from these supercomputers over that time scale are quite good. But those errors start to magnify. And so as you look over longer timescales that might enable you to take more corrective action to prepare for an extreme event, the error starts to be great. And so taking the average of these lines here on the right would not provide a lot of informational value. And that's exactly what we see. So here we have a graph of the European model, which is generally considered the best in the world, at predicting the precipitation and its skill versus the historical average. So 0 is the historical average here. What we see is a significant improvement over that first week, about 40%. Over the next week, it starts to trail off and then continues to decline after we get past that 12 to 14 day mark. There's a number of other problems with supercomputer models as well, aside from this timing issue. They're very focused on sort of the initial conditions surrounding a different area. They don't take into account things like ocean circulation. They have very high computing requirements, which makes them very hard to integrate into workflows, build additional analytical tools on top of. That makes them expensive, sort of harder to run. And so overall, they're not super flexible and adaptable. Again, they're great at what they were initially built to do, but as we try and stretch them, we're pushing beyond what they're technologically best at. And so that's where we get to AI, because of course, with a machine learning tool, you could in theory train on all the golf swings in the world, and rather than just running that simulation 1,000 times, use a complex model to determine, given everything you know about the initial conditions, where is the ball likely to go. And you can actually learn from golf swings that have taken place all over the world, not just the one you're looking at, and incorporate those factors as well. The result is likely to be a bit more accurate, and it's also going to be lighter weight because you're not actually running this physical dynamical model thousands of times. The problem is there are not enough golf swings in the world to train a machine learning model on weather. So this was the challenge that Climate AI faced when initially trying to crack this problem. But thankfully, there was another industry that had already solved it, which is autonomous vehicles. So autonomous vehicles face the problem of not hitting pedestrians and jaywalkers. That seems like a really important problem. But of course, there's not enough observations of autonomous vehicles interacting with pedestrians and jaywalkers. And for reasons that you can probably guess, you don't want to simulate that interaction thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Or you don't want to recreate that interaction thousands and thousands and thousands of times. So what they did instead is to simulate that interaction, create a computer simulation of what would happen if an autonomous vehicle was encountered with a pedestrian, and then transfer learned on the simulated world into the real world, and building up a training data set of fake data, essentially. And that's exactly what Climate AI did, using historical simulations of climate, for example, ones that have been used to understand what the climate might have been like when the dinosaurs are around. Sure, that's not super applicable to us, but it still gives you a sense of how different weather conditions inform reality. And taking this patented transfer learning approach, Climate AI was able to beat all of the leading government models. So you can see the black line in the middle is what happened, the blue line is what we predicted, and then all these other lines are different government models. And the Climate AI result was a significant improvement, an average error of less than 0.2 degrees. The implications of this approach are, of course, at a starting point, a better forecast. So you can see that same graph that we reviewed before, where you have now our prediction, which, again, the European model, very good in the beginning, but the Climate AI model, the machine learning approach, is able to maintain that level of accuracy going out to a further time horizon. Because we're not running a bunch of different actual physical simulations, it makes it lighter weight, cheaper to run, more accessible, able to build more tools around it, which leads to better decisions. So to close out, I want to just give one example of the type of decisions that a better forecast can lead to specifically for agriculture. So we at Climate AI often talk about it's not just about warmer, but by when, how much, and what impact does it have. And here's an example looking at the increase in extreme heat days across the growing season. The green bar is today, the red is 2030 to 2040. And what we see is about a 50% movement in that middle line there, the expected value, in the month of April, which is critical for this crop, and also a very wide range of outcomes. So while this graphically, this increase in number of days may not seem significant, that in this case was actually enough to cross the magic killing condition threshold, whereby in many of the years that we would expect in the future, you will not be able to grow this crop. However, as you can see by the lower bound range, in many years, you will be able to. And this is where a long-term 6-month ahead forecast of the season will enable you to tell you what year are you in. So using that information, you can imagine a big company says, this is not a year where in that location we can grow this crop. We're going to need to source it from elsewhere. And we can also work with our growers to make sure that they are rotating in other crops that are more heat tolerant, maybe even that love higher temperatures and thrive there, but you weren't able to grow previously because it was actually too cold. This might seem far-fetched, but actually many of the customers you're working with are working with their growers to accomplish this transition. Why? Well, because it's a very tight supply market. They've invested in these growers for years. They've built them into their ecosystem. They've got them producing reliable, high-quality outputs, and they don't want to lose them. And I also like to think it's because hopefully they're good people as well. But the key that underpins that is simply knowing what is going to happen in the upcoming growing season. And that is the problem that climate AI and AI in general can help solve. And so before we break for questions, because this is a conference full of people who are very interested in and passionate about bringing technical solutions to solve climate problems, I want to just highlight a couple other interesting areas to get into in the ag space. So there's a lot more work to be done on forecasting, specifically around finer resolution forecasts when it comes to rainfall. The old image of a cartoon of one cloud raining on someone is actually not that wrong when it comes to how precipitation works, especially in these sort of more open rural areas. There's a lot of interesting technological applications of precision agriculture. Fundamentally, the idea, how do we do more in terms of food output or higher quality food output with less resources? And finally, there's a huge problem in supply chain and around cold storage. 40% of water used in agriculture in India goes into food that spoils in shipping. And 40% of water used in agriculture in the United States goes to food that's thrown away. Two very different sides of a similar problem related to supply chain optimization. And that's an interesting space to check out as well. If these topics sound interesting to you, I would encourage you to ask questions now, but also to go into the expo and look at Climate AI's podcast or newsletter. We talk very little about ourselves and more generally about these intersections of food, technology, and climate change. And so if this sounds interesting to you, I'm sure you'll enjoy that as well. And with that, I'll stop sharing here and open up to questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Will. We have a number of questions for you from the audience. Our first is from Elliot, and he wants to know your thoughts on smallholder farmer reliance on commodity crops versus specialized and diversified crops with less reliable markets, but potentially wider ranges of acceptable environmental conditions. And he wants to know if crop selection can be de-risked with this kind of variance modeling.
That's a very good question. So the short answer is yes. Well, let me start with the transition either from a commodity crop to a specialty crop and then onto organic or sort of any type of label-based product is a very expensive one. And so there's a lot that needs to be done on the investment side to make sure that farmers who don't have that access to capital can make that investment and also get the market access that ensures they'll be paid back for that investment. But if you think about then, you're talking about not just on a yearly timeline, but a somewhat longer time horizon for that investment to pay back, then yes, sort of a longer term forecast becomes a critical piece of de-risking that. And we see that a lot in the agricultural lending and land owning space.
And then Matt would like to know what kind of machine learning architecture Climate AI uses.
That's a very good question. I wouldn't. I don't have a great answer there. I think there's quite a bit behind the scenes, and it kind of depends on how much data is available. But let me follow up on that one.
All right, and Andy would like to know, are changes in temperature something that can be resolved with GMOs? Obviously, companies in this space are not the greatest right now, but maybe the technology can be applied to the problem.
So the GMO question is one of the sort of the critical questions that's been facing technology and ag for a very long time. And I think, Andy, you described it really well, which is, or at least, so I'll give Climate AI doesn't have like a point of view on this. And I think everyone has a different point of view. I'll give mine. I think you described it perfectly, that like the market structure, the problem for me is the market structure around GMOs and the way that it just increases the monopoly power of large players and their ability to unfairly influence sort of prices and uptake of their products. But that to me is not a problem in the technology itself. Certainly, I think that GMOs kind of have to be part of the solution. We see one thing that we see a lot, but it's not just GMOs, it's also just different climate smart breeding, because you can create variants of plants without genetic modification. You just breed for it. And one thing we see a lot is shorter season crops. As you start to get sort of hotter summers that mean you can't plant, or that means like, your window for growing basically shrinks. Otherwise you run the risk of an extreme temperature. So can you get a crop that will come to maturity more quickly? So yes, I think technologically that's going to be important, but the market question is a big one.
Okay, another one from Elliot. How do you avoid overfitting when relying on historical data and simulations? Do you have a forward-looking error rate for climate level predictions, or would you have to run for some years before that number will be meaningful?
So that's the answer is that like the model will it depends on what range we are forecasting. But in general, like we would always say that when we first turn on the model for a specific location, it's like at best like the average, and then it will continue to improve over time. So I think, that duration will depend on the timeline of the forecast. So.
All right, I'm sorry if I pronounced this wrong. From Abinash, how far has Climate AI made progress in terms of predicting extreme weather events?
So quite a bit of progress. I think the main sort of piece is around looking sort of far out. To give an example, when you plant a crop, that might be sort of 3 to 4 months before that crop comes to maturity. And so, and what's sort of bracketing it on the back end would be maybe like an early winter would mean that, I need to plant that crop sooner. Otherwise I'm going to get snow and it's going to kill the crop and my whole year is wasted. So an example was that we were successfully able to predict sort of the onset of an early snowfall a full year ahead, which would inform how growers, when they decided to basically start their growing season. People often ask, like when there's like big flooding in Australia or the big Texas event, how much better at predicting that were you than like existing players? Well, again, that's a time horizon question. So in the near term, everyone predicted it because it was like quite obviously going to happen. And like weather forecasting in the 2-week period is quite good. So what we'd focus more on is like hot year, cold year, early frost, late frost, the type of sort of things that can really influence timing and suitability of a crop in a given season.
All right, and here's one from Anna Ga. Do you know who are the most successful startups currently working in the food waste and food loss space? Anna
Ga, I see you've listed Appeal and Imperfect. Those would be the two that come to my mind as well. I think the problem, and Imperfect has actually kind of pivoted recently around this. The problem with food waste is that it's very like a local issue. People waste food at their homes and at restaurants. And so you can build like a great sort of localized infrastructure, but it's hard to scale. So Imperfect has actually switched to sort of focusing more on supply chain food waste and working with companies to sort of build custom solutions across their supply chains as a way to try and solve that problem. I think it's pretty new, but it seems to me like a better solution to solve that scalability issue. That's not to say that there aren't amazing organizations and small companies operating, but the challenge to scale seems very, very difficult for me to see a way around right now, but I'm probably wrong.
Okay, and here's one from Henry. Are you working at all on fixing food companies' current forecasts for how extreme weather events will impact supply and demand for their products? For example, much shorter winter seasons for winter products like tea or coffee.
Yes. So we generally have sort of the simplest level. We have sort of two products. One is just sort of a forecast with a set of alerts and sort of decision tools around what that forecast means. But then sort of there's a higher level product where we have a separate set of machine learning models that ingest the company's historical data and can use that to make very specific forecasts as to what an extreme event in one region might mean for supply or quality in that region. And so it sort of becomes like a very customized forecast. And then you can also use that insight to help support growers and say like, hey, we know we've typically been operating at 30 degrees Celsius is really bad. What we actually see is that 27 is the right number. So let's start our preventative measures at a lower temperature. And so you start to use the insights in that model to influence practices as well.
Great. And another one from Andy. They are curious about the shift to indoor farming and how this affects the climate change question. So
the indoor farming, I guess two answers to that. One is, so there's like high-tech indoor farming, which is, I think, super really interesting and really well suited to developed markets where you have like access to the energy, a stable electrical grid and things like that. And you can bring more like local sustainable foods to markets. So I don't know as much about that space other than I think it's very promising, very cool, and a very attractive business proposition. But many greenhouses, especially in the developing world, are like plastic sheets that provide some protection of the elements, but are still just as sensitive to external climate factors. And I would imagine an indoor farm is too, because you still need to counterbalance what you have on the outside, but probably a high-tech one has better solutions for that. So I would say it's a companion solution. There will always be weather-dependent agriculture. And I think indoor farming at a high-tech is a nice complement to that.
Okay, and Stanley would like to know about the behavioral changes involved with relying more on AI models versus the Farmer's Almanac.
So that's a really good question. I think it depends on sort of what behavior you're trying to change. If it's a simple behavior of what am I going to do in the next couple of weeks, or if I'm going to change my planting date, usually people have already had enough misses using the historical average over the past couple of years that they're pretty open to it. When it comes to completely changing how they do supply chain planning or things that have like very real costs to them, that sort of usually you might use both in parallel for a while until you get enough data points. But as the machine learning folks will know, you can do sort of a leave one out analysis. So look at how you would have predicted train on historical years, leave out a year from the training set and validate it. And so you start to be able to get a lot of historical proof points pretty quickly, which tends to be quite persuasive. But yeah, I think it just depends on the criticality of the decision. People will want more redundancy for the near term on higher criticality decisions.
Okay, Ari wants to know if you are familiar with Jupyter Intelligence, and if so, how would you contrast your approach with them, either technically or business model wise?
So I am familiar with Jupyter. I'm more familiar with the business model differences. Our technical team could probably talk about that. I think the technical side is just sort of fundamentally we have a proprietary forecast model, and I'm not necessarily sure that they do. But the primary business is in business model. They have a really, I think, a very useful approach, what I would call a horizontal approach, where they're looking at, like they have like a flood index or a fire index. So they're trying to build products around specific events and essentially have people like subscribe to the likelihood of those events. So it's very useful, especially for insurance companies or industries that are maybe not quite as weather dependent, that just sort of need to know when these things might happen. In industries that are highly weather dependent, like agriculture, constitutes a flood or a heat risk or any extreme event varies by crop and by geography. And so that's why from a business model perspective, Climate AI is very vertically focused and on building forecasts and tools that are very specific and actionable within food and ag. So in truth, we have never competed against them directly sort of in a bid. I think we've collaborated with them before I joined Climate AI. So I think it's a really useful approach for a lot of the market, but I think it's sort of maybe less applicable in food and ag, at least I hope.
Great. And Abby Nash would like to know, what is your take on understanding or estimating environmental impact quantitatively using machine learning AI models for automating tasks?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I think it sort of depends on if you can eliminate redundancy in actions and shippings and like eliminate waste of physical products, like of course in agriculture, you certainly can probably have a positive environmental benefit from that. You'd have to net it against the additional computing power requirements, which isn't necessarily always a winning calculation. So yeah, I think it's applied to certain use cases. I could see that as being very applicable and relevant.
Okay, well, it looks like we are done with our questions from the audience, but I have a question for you, Will. As you may or may not be aware, the mission of CTAN is to help people in technical fields transition into climate tech. And given your experience in climate tech as regards to agriculture, do you have any tips for people who may be working in a technical capacity and are interested in this field and want to get involved?
I mean, my primary tip would be that now is a very, very good time to be entering that space. There's just a lot of investor interest in trying to solve this problem, or more cynically, profit from the solution of that problem. And so there's going to be a lot of different companies that are coming up, and I think in general should be a lot of job opportunities. So now is a very good time to think more specifically. The only other thing I would offer is it's very easy to get excited about a company whose mission that you really care about, but don't forget that a lot of your day will still be spent doing whatever your job is. And so think hard about the type of role you want, the type of team you want. Don't leave all the other things that you would do when conducting a job search off to the side just because you think a company is going to change the world. You still need to be happy day in, day out as well. And I'm sure you'll be able to find that, but that would be my second piece.
Okay, great. Any final words, Will?
No, I mean, I think these were really great questions. Apologies, I'm not able to get into more depth on the technical side, but I look forward to catching up with folks in the various networking conversations. And thanks for your questions and your interest.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, Will, for speaking. Don't forget, Climate AI has a booth in our Expo section where you can check out their newsletter and podcast link. And we'll see the rest of you at 12:30 for our next speaker. Thanks again.